Welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I am joined by Em, a self-professed plant nerd and host of Rooted Podcast. Welcome to the show, Em.
Hi, Sophie. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. So here's how this works. Em will have 3 minutes to talk about something that she loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything she wants. Our only requirement is that she loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, Em?
As ready as I'll ever be.
Good. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so freaking much?
Okay, so the thing I love so freaking much is plant history. I love it because it's kind of a great mix between science and storytelling, which is just really appealing for my brain, honestly. I've always loved science, but I also have this need to share stories and learn more about them. So while that is a big part of science itself, it's not something that was always really celebrated in school for me, which makes plant history kind of this interesting mix of the two. It's also just a really great way to understand different cultures and time periods. Looking at plant history can really give us a sense of what different cultures valued at the time, how they lived their lives, what they were worried about, things that they were trying to solve, problems they were looking into, all of that really interesting stuff. And I love that it does it in a way that is kind of free of judgment for the most part, because we're really not talking about people. We're not talking about specifics. We're talking about plants. So it's really a good way to kind of dive into things with a more cohesive understanding and really look at the ways that plants are growing alongside of people. And it can be a really helpful lens to look at ourselves now. Plants can really help us see how we've grown and changed, not only in terms of like climate change and things like that, but also things that we value, things that we find important. So we can look at them from a sense of cultivation, right? Like farming is an important thing to us, but the different traits that we're breeding into the plants that we're growing can really tell us a lot about where we are, what we're worried about, that kind of stuff, and how we've changed. So looking into the different ways that plants are used as medicines, the way they're used in storytelling, and kind of that importance they're playing in society today versus the importance they had in societies a long time ago. Another reason is just that plants are so interesting and cool, which is very nerdy, but there are so many interesting things about plants, from the way that they grow and the ways that they've adapted. The fact that some plants are growing fully in the water, and then there are other plants that say, I don't even really need the water, or roots for that matter. I'm just going to hang out in trees and like suck up the moisture. So there's just all kinds of really cool things there, and they are just so interesting, I think, to study, to look at. There's so much there. And there's just so many stories when it comes to plants. One thing that I love doing in my research, and that we do a lot on my podcast, is looking at the same plant, but using it to look at a variety of different cultures and places, because a lot of different plants have a very wide spread. They're not just native to one region, or if they are, they may have been cultivated in other regions. So
Go ahead and finish your thought.
it's interesting to see the ways that they kind of grow and change and adapt with that culture and how they're prized there.
That's fascinating. Thank you for telling us about plant history today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I'm curious how you first got interested in this, because I remember learning about plants sometimes in school, but I don't remember ever learning about the history of plants.
Got it. Yes, it's been kind of an interesting journey for me. So I started being interested mostly when we would talk about like folklore and mythology. I just noticed that the stories that really caught my attention were the ones that involved plants. And my family, we are all big plant nerds, so plants have always interested me. And then probably the nerdiest sentence of all time, once when I was watching Jurassic Park, I realized that Ellie, one of the main characters, was a paleobiologist, which means that she's studying like ancient plant life. And I thought that was probably the coolest job of all time. And from there, I just kind of started doing these deep dives into plants.
I want to zero in on that mythology comment before. What are some examples of plants in mythology that caught your interest?
Oh gosh, I really love, there's a story in Greek mythology that henbane, which is a really common use plant in witchcraft as well as in a bunch of other different cultures. Essentially, it's the plant that people are always wearing around their necks. And the story goes that the reason they're wearing that henbane is so that they forget who they were in their past lives, so they can't leave.
Oh.
So it kind of keeps them trapped. And we dive into that more in episode 1 of my podcast, because it's one of the first stories I ever heard that really got my attention.
That sounds like it could go in like cool directions and also creepy directions depending on the story.
Oh my gosh, it does. And I think that's the joy of plant history is you can really, it takes you everywhere.
I loved how you put it that if you look at plant history, you start to see how plants are growing alongside how people are growing. Could you give some specific examples of, not to spoil too much from your podcast, but some specific examples of how understanding plant history has helped you understand different cultures?
I would love to. I think a good example is actually wild carrots. So, wild carrots, they've been cultivated throughout a variety of different cultures, but they're primarily native to Asia. That's a good one when you're looking at kind of our food sources because we've changed the wild carrot so much in terms of color and size and flavor. So, obviously, those are things that are really important to us and to different cultures as well. So, when you're thinking about China, obviously, they have a very large population. And so they really need food that can support their larger population without taking up a ton of room.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really interesting crop. And it's something we're actually studying now again because we've bred a lot of and this is a real scientific term, the weediness out of our food crops. So we're actually studying wild carrots now to understand how some of those weedier kind of characteristics might be more beneficial to try to breed back in.
What kind of traits, what kind of traits count as weedy, first of all, and which ones would be beneficial?
Oh my gosh, I love this question so much. So, weedy traits would be things like drought tolerance, tolerance to climate change, natural ability to kind of withstand pests. And those are all things we kind of need in our food crops now as we're coming up against climate change and as pests are becoming bigger and bigger problems
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of the food that we grow doesn't necessarily have a lot of those characteristics. We kind of bred it out to try to make it kind of just like tastier and more nutrient rich. And obviously, we don't want to lose good taste and we don't want to lose the nutrient density, but we do need to start thinking more about how could we be more sustainable with our water use? How could we have crops that rely on us a little less? That kind of thing.
Yeah, we want to make sure that we can continue to grow more plants in the future, not just for today.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a huge part of it.
In your research, have you come across any plants that are just so weird?
I feel like all plants can be kind of weird, but one of the ones I did a big deep dive on recently was cordyceps, which are probably most famously, the inspiration behind The Last of Us.
Oh,
It's a fungus that kind of takes over different living organisms, and it is straight up. It looks like it's from a sci-fi movie for sure. It's hard to believe it's real.
so plant history for you encompasses fungi as well.
It does, yes. I am not a plant history purist, as in like only plants, just because so many fungi fit in so well with those stories. So for me, it's hard to draw the line anyway.
Well, yeah, there's lots of fairy tales that feature like magical mushrooms and such.
Yes, yeah. And I think a lot of horticulturalists end up kind of being interested in both anyway. At least I am. So for me, I was like, I'm not going to not research something and subject a bunch of people to it. How could I?
Is there anything that you don't like about plant history? And if so, how do you handle that?
I would say the biggest thing I don't like about plant history is the same thing I would say about regular history. A lot of it is kind of controlled by non-marginalized groups. And so we end up losing a lot of history and a lot of really nuanced uses and ideas to translation. And obviously, there's a whole bunch of like with religious persecution, we lose a lot of how plants were used in a way that may have been considered too witchy for Christianity. And we lose a lot of different histories and uses that come from different regions of the world. So I would say that's the thing that is probably the most challenging in studying this. And to counter that, I just really try to find sources and firsthand account stories from people in those marginalized groups who have had that wisdom kind of passed down and are willing to share it, and just really make that effort in my research to try to account for that when I'm looking at some of the bigger sources that are out there.
It sounds like a really valuable journey you're on there. And thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you would like to learn more about plant history or our guest, Em, you can find the link to her podcast, Rooted, in the episode description. And if you have something you love so freaking much you want to tell me all about it, consider this your invitation to join the show. I Love This Thing So Freaking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU the Window at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.